So guys, when we're experiencing the infirmity, the weakness that comes from being clothed in perishable flesh. You want to know why you feel weakness? I mean, some people want to know, why do I even feel weakness? Do you know why you feel weakness? Because you got a body that's perishable. A perishable body can feel weakness. And so when we are experiencing the infirmity that comes from being clothed in a perishable body and that comes from walking in a world that is shadowed by death, what we find in God is a compassionate kindness towards us. That's what we find in God, right? And so in that place where we're beset with weakness and we're feeling pressed in on, man, what we need is compassion, and what we need is grace. And we find that in God. There's strength for you when you're feeling weakness in the presence of God. There's comfort for your affliction in the presence of God. Everything that you need for your life is contained in the presence of God, right? That's what that verse is saying. And so verse 16 says, let us come boldly unto the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help us in the time of need. Now, when is the time of need? The time of need that Hebrews 4 talks about is when we are being tempted. That's the time of need. And again, we're going to blow up your concept of temptation because it talks about the temptation common to man in the letter to the Hebrews. It says Jesus was tempted every which way we were tempted. Right? Well, if you sit with the concept that temptation means, well, I'm a man, so I'll just use an example as a man. Growing up as a man, listen, man, sometimes you were tempted to lay with a woman. Right? If that's how you define temptation, and then you come and say Jesus was tempted every which way like I was, then that would mean Jesus also wanted to lay with a woman. Well, Jesus said if you thought it in your head, you've done it. Which would make Jesus a sinner under that definition of temptation. So that's not the temptation that's common to human beings. That's not what it's talking about. Because if Jesus thought he wanted to lay with the woman, that means he would be a sinner already. And so he was confronted with every temptation that we've all felt, right? And it will help you. You'll actually find mercy and grace in your time of need just in understanding these things properly. Because you'll see the Lord with you, right? And so the time of need that Hebrews 4 is talking about is when we're being tempted. And when we're being tempted is when we feel weakness, when we feel lack, when we encounter tribulation in the earth, when we feel that an injustice has been committed against us. That's the time of need. That's when you're in need. That's when you're in need of God resisting in you. That's when you're in need of the mercy that's in God, the compassion that's in His heart. That's when you're in need of the grace that's contained in the Lord. That's when you're in need of it, right? That's when we need God. That's when we're being tempted. And you know what we're being tempted to do when we feel weakness, when we feel lack, when we encounter tribulation? When we experience injustice in this world. Do you know what we're being tempted to do? Perfect our own lives from sin. And again, back to the definition of sin. I'm not talking about perfecting your life from bad behavior. I'm talking about perfecting your life from the injustice that's come upon you. I'm talking about perfecting your life from the tribulation you've encountered. I'm talking about perfecting your life from the hell that's come to your house. You're being tempted to take up your own life. You're being tempted to try to sanctify yourself from the corruption you see going on. That's what weakness tempts you to do. You don't like feeling weak. You say this weakness isn't right. Then you look out and you see the thing that's causing you the weakness. And you're being tempted to make it straight. You're being tempted to enlist your own strength instead of looking at the strength of God. These guys in the letter to the Hebrews, they saw corruption and death all around them still. And do you know what the sin that so easily beset them was? They thought, we're going to be sanctified from sin by performing the works of the law still. Offering sacrifices still, doing baptism still. That's how we're going to be sanctified. They were tempted by what they saw going on around them to continue to try to sanctify themselves from sin. That's why the author of Hebrews says, seeing we have such a great cloud of witnesses around us that testify of the Lord's ability to perfect us from sin. Let us lay aside that weight of trying to perfect ourselves from death. Let us lay aside the weight of trying to perfect ourselves from the injustices we've encountered in this world. Oh no. You know what subconsciously what I'm telling you is God's going to help you stay on the cross. And we don't want that, because everything in us, fight or flight. Either fight to preserve our own life or run to preserve our own life. Everything in us feels that when we encounter injustice and tribulation. That's why it's the time of need. We're in need in that moment because we're being tempted with the sin that so easily besets us. That's why it so easily besets us. Because, listen, man, we know we're supposed to have life, and if we encounter something that we think is taking life from us or could take life from us, we're immediately going to be filled with the idea that we're going to perfect our lives from that death. That's why it so easily besets us. It's a normal thought, if you're being nailed to a cross, to try to not be nailed to the cross. Isn't it? I mean, do I got to tell any of you guys that you don't want to be nailed to a cross? I mean, you just know, don't you? Well, what about Jesus? You think he didn't know that there was pain involved at that cross? You know what the sin that tried to so easily beset Jesus was? To take up the weight of preserving his life from death. Take up the weight of preserving his own life, perfecting his own life from the injustice that was going to come upon him at the cross. That was his time of need. When he's sweating blood, that was his time of need. What was he being tempted with? Not going to the cross. Avoiding the cross. Right? And it's an easy thought to think, I'm not going to that cross. Like nobody had to help you to think that. You know what I'm saying? Like if I send you a letter and tell you, man, Friday's coming and that's the cross for you. Listen, you're going to feel fight or flight. You're either going to get all your biggest, baddest friends to fight the people, or you're going to run, right? And be nowhere to be found. But Jesus didn't take up the sword there, right? So that's the time of need. And what we need in those moments, or the comfort that we need when we're being afflicted by the tribulation and the injustice, the strength that we need when we're beset with the weakness that comes when we encounter corruption. All those things are contained in God's presence. And so God doesn't leave us alone. He doesn't leave us to come to him by ourselves. He draws us to himself, is what he does.